The sun burned low over the wide Nevada desert, turning the horizon into a smear of copper and violet as the training field stretched silent and empty except for the dust trails left behind by the last Humvee. The air was still, heavy with the scent of hot sand and spent gunpowder, and the targets that lined the far ridgeline shimmered with the mirage of heat rising off the earth. She had been told this would just be routine practice, another day of running through the motions, another checklist of fundamentals to tick off before being dismissed back to the barracks, but nothing about the way the Navy SEAL looked at her made it feel ordinary. He was older, scarred in that way where you could tell the marks were not accidents but stories carved into skin, each one a survival, each one proof of having faced the kind of violence most civilians only saw on late-night news reels. His calm carried weight. His silence carried more. And when he finally turned, cradling the enormous rifle in his arms, it was as if the desert itself seemed to hush in anticipation. She had seen weapons before, handled a few standard-issue rifles in training sessions, fired off rounds under the supervision of instructors who spoke with more bark than patience. But nothing prepared her for the moment he placed the Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifle into her hands. Its weight staggered her immediately, a crushing reminder that this was not a toy, not a movie prop, but a weapon designed to punch holes through armored vehicles and bring down enemies from miles away. Her arms trembled under its heft and she nearly flinched at the idea that he trusted her with it, her of all people, the one who still struggled to steady her breath when pulling a trigger. She looked up at him, half expecting him to laugh, to pull it back, to say this was a joke, but instead he gave her the faintest nod, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for a trick of the heat, and then he stepped back. Not just a single pace, but several, his boots crunching against gravel until the space between them grew wider, until it was clear he wasn't going to hover over her shoulder or guide her hands like a patient teacher. He was handing her responsibility raw, unfiltered, and without any safety net. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she sank down into the dust, the rifle's bipod digging into the earth with a metallic scrape. She stretched out behind it, awkward at first, adjusting her elbows, her cheek finding the unfamiliar curve of the stock, and then finally, after shifting her body a dozen tiny ways, she aligned with the scope. The world narrowed instantly. Gone was the vast desert, gone were the rusted trucks in the distance, gone was even the man watching silently behind her. There was only the circle of glass, the reticle dancing faintly with her unsteady breath, and the faint silhouette of a steel target glinting against the fading light. She inhaled, deep but uneven, tasting dust, swallowing fear. The rifle felt alive under her touch, every ounce of it radiating potential, the sheer destructive force coiled and waiting like a predator. She remembered every instruction drilled into her from prior sessions. Slow squeeze, not a pull, steady posture, trust your body to become an extension of the machine, but nothing in those words could quiet the knowledge that one mistake could tear the weapon from her control or send a round skimming wildly off into the emptiness. Behind her, the SEAL still hadn't spoken. His silence was both infuriating and strangely empowering, as though he knew words would only clutter her head, as though this moment had to belong entirely to her and her alone. She forced herself to exhale, long and measured, and in that breath tried to surrender the tremor in her arms. The crosshair steadied. Her finger tightened against the trigger, inch by inch, until there was no turning back. The recoil was a monster. It punched through her chest, rattled her teeth, and drove her shoulder into the earth, but she held her ground, jaw clenched, eyes snapping open wide enough to catch the instant of impact. Far downrange, the steel target erupted in a puff of dust and a ringing echo that came back seconds later, a ghostly chime that seemed to dance on the wind. For a heartbeat she couldn't breathe. Her entire body trembled, not from fear this time but from awe, from the enormity of the moment, from the way power and precision had fused together in her hands to create something that defied language. She rolled slightly to the side, gasping air, blinking against the sting of sweat in her eyes, and then she saw him, standing there, arms folded, expression unreadable. His eyes, though, betrayed him. They carried something between approval and recognition, as though he'd seen this exact transformation before, the way a person changes the first time they realize they're capable of more than they ever believed. She pushed herself up slowly, still feeling the ache in her shoulder, still half disbelieving that she had done it at all. The rifle lay heavy in the dust, gleaming faintly in the twilight, and she stared at it like it was both a curse and a gift. She didn't know why he had chosen her, why on a day that was supposed to be just routine practice he had decided to thrust her into this trial, but she knew with certainty that nothing about this moment was ordinary. Something had shifted. Something inside her had awakened. And the Navy SEAL, still silent, still watching, seemed to know it. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache as she lifted herself back onto her elbows, dust clinging to the sweat on her arms, and for a long moment she didn't even want to look at the Barrett lying there in the sand because it still felt like it belonged to someone else, someone stronger, steadier, someone forged for war instead of someone like her who had been told all her life that she was too fragile for such things, too soft for steel and fire. Yet the echo of that shot still rang in her body, humming through her bones, a strange kind of rhythm that wouldn't settle down, and she realized she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She turned finally, her gaze cutting toward the seal, but he hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, hadn't even given her the reassurance of a smile, only the unbroken silence of a man who had seen this test unfold countless times, who knew that whatever came next had to rise from her and not from him. The weight of his expectation pressed harder than the rifle ever had, and she felt the sting of frustration, the sudden flare of anger that he would just hand her a weapon capable of tearing through steel and then step away as if she were already meant to know what to do. Her fingers twitched and she swallowed a curse, but before the bitterness could bloom too far she found herself crawling back behind the rifle, setting her shoulder once more against the stock, as though drawn by something she couldn't name. This time the weapon didn't feel as alien. The dust on the grip felt like her own skin. The bipod dug into the ground with more certainty. Her cheek settled against the stock, and when her eye found the scope, the desert shrank again into a circle of possibility. She lined up another target, one farther away, smaller, its silhouette barely distinct against the ripple of heat that still danced across the horizon. Her breath came easier this time, steadier, though her heartbeat still thundered as though it wanted to break free of her chest. She squeezed again. The trigger breaking beneath her finger, and the rifle roared like thunder, cracking the world in half. The recoil shoved into her shoulder, but she had braced better, her body rolling with the force instead of against it, and the shot rang true. The steel plate quivered even from this distance, the sound floating back faint and hollow but certain. She let out a broken laugh, a sound of disbelief and exhilaration, her lips curling without permission. That laugh, soft and raw, seemed to ripple through the space between them because for the first time the seal shifted, his arms uncrossing, his stance relaxing as though some invisible test had been passed. He stepped forward, slow, boots grinding against gravel, until his shadow loomed over her where she still lay sprawled in the dirt. She thought he would take the rifle back, reclaim it as if her time with it had only been borrowed, but instead he crouched beside her, his eyes sharp and steady, his voice low when he finally spoke for the first time since handing her the weapon. "Again," he said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of command, the kind that doesn't ask whether you're ready but tells you that you already are. She obeyed before she even thought about it, chambering another round with clumsy but determined hands, her breath catching at the mechanical click of power sliding into place. She set her eye against the scope, the sun now burning lower, painting the world in deeper shades of red and gold. The target wavered, small and unyielding, and she realized that this wasn't about hitting steel anymore. It was about her, about proving to herself that she wasn't defined by hesitation or weakness, that she could carry the weight of something larger than herself. Her body moved with greater fluidity, the adjustments less frantic, her breathing syncing with the rise and fall of the crosshairs. The shot cracked. The target shuddered. A second hit. This time she didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. Instead she felt a stillness, a strange calm flowing into her veins like cold water, as though the rifle had siphoned away her fear and left behind only focus. The SEAL watched closely, and though his face remained hard, his eyes softened with something she couldn't quite read. Approval, yes, but there was also something heavier there, something that told her this wasn't just training, that he hadn't chosen her at random, that the rifle in her hands was less a weapon and more a doorway. She pulled back, letting the rifle rest in the dust, her chest rising and falling as though she had sprinted a mile. "Why me?" she asked suddenly, her voice hoarse from the silence that had stretched so long between them. "Why give it to me?" He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her, the desert wind tugging at his hair, the fading light etching deep lines across his weathered face. Finally he spoke, each word slow, deliberate, like stones laid one at a time to build something lasting. "Because one day," he said, "you're going to have to choose whether to carry weight like this, or let it crush someone else. Better you learn now." His words sank deep, heavier than the rifle, heavier than the desert night closing in around them, and though she wanted to demand more, to understand why he believed such a thing about her, she realized from his tone that he wouldn't explain further. The truth was he didn't need to. Deep inside, in the quiet space where fear and exhilaration had clashed, she already knew he was right. She brushed dirt from her palms, her body aching, her mind whirling, but when he stood and offered no hand to help her rise, she pushed herself up alone. That too was part of the lesson. Night crept over the desert slowly, swallowing the last of the sun's fire until only the faint glow of the stars and the cold white eye of the moon remained, stretching shadows long across the training ground. The rifle lay between them like some ancient relic, its dark steel glinting faintly, the barrel still warm from the shots she had fired. She rubbed at her sore shoulder, wincing at the bruise that was already beginning to rise, but inside her chest there was no weakness, only a quiet storm that refused to die down. The SEAL walked a few paces ahead, his stride deliberate, his back broad beneath the dark fabric of his shirt, and she followed because it felt natural to, because in that silence she understood that the lesson was far from over. He stopped finally at the edge of the firing line where an old table stood half buried in dust, a lantern resting on its surface. He lit it with practiced ease, the flame catching and casting a small circle of gold that barely pushed against the darkness. She stepped into that circle, dust swirling faintly around her boots, and found him watching her not with the cool detachment of an instructor but with the steady weight of a man who had chosen her for reasons she still couldn't grasp. He motioned toward the rifle. "Again," he said, his voice low but steady, and though exhaustion burned in her arms and her ears still rang from the earlier shots, she didn't hesitate. She lowered herself onto her stomach once more, the hard-packed earth pressing into her ribs, the desert chill seeping through her clothes now that the heat of the day had fled. The Barrett felt different at night, colder, heavier, almost alive with some hidden breath that pulsed faintly beneath her touch. She chambered another round, the sound of metal sliding against metal sharp in the silence, and adjusted her position until the reticle caught a faint silhouette far downrange, a target barely visible under the ghostly light. Her breath fogged faintly in the cool air as she steadied herself. The SEAL stood behind her, a silent shadow, and though she couldn't see his face she felt the weight of his eyes on her, not judging but expecting. She fired. The recoil thundered into her body, the flash igniting the night for an instant, and she lost the target in the scope before the faint ringing of steel drifted back like a whisper from the darkness. A hit. She swallowed hard, her heart racing, and before she could celebrate he spoke again. "Reload." She obeyed, her fingers finding the rhythm faster now, her movements smoother despite the trembling in her muscles. Another shot. Another echo. Another hit. The rhythm grew, load, breathe, fire, absorb the blow, and with each round she felt the fear bleeding out of her veins, replaced by something sharper, steadier, like molten metal cooling into steel. Yet beneath it all was a strange pull, an emotional current she hadn't expected, because every time her fingers squeezed the trigger she wasn't just striking steel, she was stepping closer to some truth about herself that frightened her more than the weapon ever could. By the time the magazine emptied her shoulder was raw, her breath ragged, but her mind felt strangely clear, stripped bare of everything unnecessary. She rolled to her side, the rifle resting in the dust again, and looked up at the sky where the stars shimmered in endless silence. The SEAL crouched beside her, his presence filling the narrow space between her heartbeat and the desert's hush. He didn't congratulate her. He didn't pat her shoulder or tell her she had done well. Instead he asked, "What did you feel?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling to put words to the storm inside her. "Power," she admitted finally, her voice low. "Fear." And then, calm. Like it wasn't about the weapon anymore. Like it was about me. He studied her with those eyes that never seemed to miss anything, then gave a single nod. "That's the truth most never find. The rifle doesn't matter. The steel, the recoil, the noise, it's all just tools. What matters is whether you let the weight define you, or whether you define yourself through it." She frowned, brushing grit from her cheek, frustration rising with her confusion. "Why me? You could have given that rifle to anyone out here. Why put this on me?" His jaw tightened, the lantern light carving his face into hard lines. "Because you remind me of someone who didn't get the choice. Someone who had to learn the weight too late." His voice carried something raw, a fracture in the armor of discipline, and she realized then that whatever this test was, it wasn't just about her. It was about him too. About memory. About ghosts. She wanted to ask who, but the words stuck in her throat, swallowed by the sudden crackle of the radio clipped to his belt. Static burst sharp against the night, followed by a voice urgent and clipped, speaking in codes she couldn't decipher. He answered with a few short bursts of his own, his tone steady, controlled, and then he looked at her again, the softness in his eyes replaced by iron. "Training's over," he said. "Now we see if you can carry it when it's real." Her stomach dropped, her mouth going dry. "Real?" she echoed, but he didn't explain. He simply stood, slinging the rifle over his shoulder with a motion so fluid it looked like it belonged there, and gestured for her to follow. The desert felt different now, heavier, as if the silence itself knew something had shifted, as if the stars leaned closer to witness what came next. She trailed him across the sand, her legs shaky, her mind racing, and though every instinct screamed that she wasn't ready, that she was still just someone who had been told this was supposed to be routine practice, another part of her, deeper, truer, knew there was no going back. The night wrapped around them like a cloak, the desert stretching endless and silent, every crunch of their boots on gravel carrying farther than it should have. She struggled to keep pace, her legs aching, her mind churning with questions that piled higher the farther they walked. The seal moved like a shadow, deliberate, certain, as though every step had been etched into him long before this night, and she followed because she couldn't do anything else, because something inside her had already bound her path to his. He carried the Barrett across his back with casual ease, its massive weight reduced to nothing in his grip, and every time the moonlight flashed against its steel, she remembered the feel of it against her shoulder, the way the recoil had rattled her bones and steadied her spirit. They reached the ridge where the training field ended, the sand sloping into a narrow cut of rock that descended into shadow. He halted there, listening, his head cocked slightly as though the desert whispered to him things she couldn't hear. Then, without a word, he led her down into the cut, the lantern left behind, the starlight their only guide. The further they went, the more the air changed, cooler now, sharper, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of oil and machinery. She realized they weren't alone out here. When they rounded the bend she saw them. 2 more men, their figures outlined in the dim glow of a portable lamp set low to the ground. They were dressed in gear she recognized but didn't fully understand, tactical vests, weapons slung across their shoulders, eyes sharp as they glanced up at the seal. No one spoke, but something passed between them in silence, a recognition, an agreement. One of the men handed the seal a small case, black, unmarked, the kind that looked like it carried either secrets or danger, and maybe both. He opened it just enough for her to glimpse what lay inside. Rows of rounds, thick and heavy, their brass gleaming dull under the lamplight, each one a promise of destruction. The seal took them, snapped the case shut, and for a moment his eyes flicked to her. She felt a jolt of unease, the sudden cold realization that whatever was happening now was not training, not staged, not safe. This was real and she was standing in the middle of it. He said nothing as he loaded the Barrett, his hands moving with the precision of muscle memory, every motion smooth and practiced. The other men murmured something low, too quick for her to catch, then melted back into the shadows, leaving only the 2 of them with the rifle and the desert night pressing close around them. She wanted to demand answers, to shout that this wasn't fair, that she had never asked to be dragged into whatever mission this was, but when she opened her mouth nothing came. The weight of the moment strangled her words, left her mute. He crouched, setting the Barrett on its bipod, and gestured for her to lie behind it. Her stomach dropped. She shook her head instinctively, fear clawing at her chest. "I can't," she whispered. His eyes narrowed, his jaw hardening. "You already did," he said simply, and that truth hit harder than any order could. He guided the rifle's barrel toward the far horizon where the ridgeline cut sharp against the sky, and when she lowered herself reluctantly into position, pressing her cheek against the stock, she saw it, through the scope, faint but distinct, the flicker of movement. At first she thought it was another steel target, some leftover from training, but then she realized it moved too fluidly, too deliberately. A figure. Then another. Her breath caught. "People," she said softly. The seal's voice was stone. "Not people. Hostiles. And they don't know we're watching." Her pulse raced, her hands clammy against the grip. The reticle hovered over one of the shapes, magnified until she could see the glint of a weapon slung across its back. Her throat closed. This wasn't paper or steel. This was flesh and blood. He crouched low beside her, his voice close to her ear, steady as bedrock. "You don't have to fire. Not unless I say. But you have to hold. You have to track them. This isn't a game." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe, forcing her trembling hands to still against the rifle. Through the scope the figures moved in silence, their outlines ghostly under the starlight, slipping along the ridge like shadows hunting prey. She adjusted her aim, the crosshairs following one of them, her finger hovering near the trigger though every fiber of her screamed to pull back, to run, to let the desert swallow her instead of this choice. Minutes stretched long, each one an eternity of held breath and hammering heartbeats, until finally one of the figures raised a hand, signaling the others. They crouched, rifles ready, scanning the horizon as though expecting danger. The seal's voice came low and final. "They're here for us." Her breath hitched. She tore her eye from the scope, staring at him in shock, but his face betrayed no fear, no surprise, only readiness. "Why me?" she asked again, desperate this time, almost pleading, but he didn't answer. His hand simply pressed against her shoulder, firm, grounding, and in that touch she felt everything he hadn't said, that she was here because fate had put her here, because sometimes the world doesn't wait for permission before demanding more of you than you ever believed you had. She turned back to the scope, her chest tight, the crosshairs trembling over the enemy silhouettes. Her finger rested on the trigger, the memory of the recoil fresh in her bones, the memory of hitting steel sharp in her mind, but this was no longer about steel. This was about a life she might take, a line she could never uncross. The silence stretched, the desert holding its breath, the seal crouched beside her like an unmovable anchor, until the figures downrange began to move again, drawing closer, unaware of the eyes locked on them through the glass. The crosshairs trembled as she followed the silhouettes, her breath shallow, her chest locked tight as though the desert air had turned to stone inside her lungs. Every instinct screamed at her to look away, to pretend this wasn't real, that she was still on a practice range where steel and dust were the only things that could fall, but the sharp glint of their rifles under the moonlight shattered that illusion. These men were armed, moving with the precision of those who knew violence intimately, and each step they took carried them closer to where she lay with the Barrett digging into the earth beneath her. The seal's presence pressed close against her shoulder, not oppressive but steady, a silent anchor that kept her from floating away into panic. His hand didn't guide the rifle, didn't force her to aim. He simply stayed there, as though to remind her that she wasn't alone, even if every decision from here would belong only to her. She swallowed, her mouth dry, the taste of dust thick on her tongue. Through the scope she could see details now, the rough fabric of their uniforms, the dark cloth masking their faces, the predatory caution in the way they scanned the ridgeline. They were hunters and they believed they were unseen. Her finger hovered over the trigger, but it felt like a cliff edge, one she wasn't sure she could step over without losing herself forever. She whispered, almost too faint for even her own ears, "I can't." But the seal's reply was firm, low, unyielding. "You already did. You've already carried the weight. This is no different, except now it matters." His words pressed into her chest, tightening her breath even more, but there was truth there she couldn't ignore. Steel targets had never been the point. Every squeeze of the trigger before tonight had been preparing her for this exact moment, though she hadn't known it. She forced herself to inhale, long and slow, the crosshairs settling again over one of the figures who had paused to signal the others. Her heartbeat hammered so loudly she thought it would drown everything else out, but somehow her hand steadied. Her world collapsed again into that narrow circle of glass, the desert, the stars, even her own fear fading until there was nothing but the reticle and the enemy within it. The silence shattered when one of the men below raised his rifle, scanning, his posture changing, sharper now, alert. They were close enough to sense something was wrong. The seal's voice came sharp and final, a single word that left no room for hesitation. "Now." Her finger tightened, the trigger breaking under her touch. The Barrett roared, fire blooming from the barrel, and the recoil slammed into her shoulder with brutal familiarity. Through the scope she saw the figure collapse, the weapon dropping from his grip as he hit the sand in a spray of dust. Her stomach lurched, bow rising, and she rolled slightly to the side, gasping, horror clawing up her throat. She had hit steel targets, yes, but this had been flesh, blood, a heartbeat silenced by her hand. Her body shook violently, the rifle lying heavy against her as if accusing her. The seal's voice cut through the chaos inside her, steady, unwavering. "Breathe. Don't look away. There are more." She forced herself back behind the scope, her tears blurring the glass, the shapes below moving frantically now, scattering for cover, their weapons raised, their shouts carried faintly on the wind. They knew where the shot had come from. Her pulse spiked into panic, her breath ragged, but the seal's calm didn't waver. "You don't stop at one. You hold until the threat is gone." She swallowed hard, her body screaming at her to drop the rifle and run, but something in his tone, unbreakable, absolute, held her in place. She chambered another round with shaking hands, the sound deafening in her ears, and forced her eye back to the scope. One of the enemies had crouched behind a rock, peeking out to fire blindly toward the ridge. She tracked him, the crosshairs sliding with his movements, her finger trembling against the trigger. She hesitated, the weight of what she had already done crushing her, but then she saw it. The muzzle flash from his rifle, the round sparking against the stone just yards from where she lay, and something broke inside her. Instinct surged forward where doubt had been and she fired. The recoil slammed, the target fell, and this time there was no gasp, no roll away. There was only silence inside her head, a terrible emptiness that came after the storm. More figures moved in the dark, their shouts ragged, their formation collapsing. The SEAL's voice guided her like a tether. Left ridge. 30 meters. Track him. Breathe. Squeeze. She obeyed, her body moving as though it belonged to someone else, her scope finding the silhouette, her trigger breaking, another shot ringing across the night. Her shoulders screamed from the repeated recoil, her cheek raw from the stock, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, but she kept firing. Each time she thought she couldn't pull the trigger again, his voice was there, steady, commanding, reminding her she could. One by one the shadows downrange fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading until the desert held its breath once more. The last shot lingered in the air like thunder rolling across the horizon, and then there was nothing but the pounding of her heart and the ringing in her ears. She pulled back finally, the Barrett smoking faintly in the cool night, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unclench them from the grip. She lay on her side in the dust, gasping, tears streaking her cheeks, her mind a blur of horror and disbelief. The SEAL crouched beside her, his hand firm against her back, grounding her. "You held," he said quietly, not praise, not celebration, just truth. She shook her head violently, her voice breaking. "I killed them." His eyes were steady, unflinching. "You saved yourself. And me. And anyone else they were hunting tonight. Don't forget that." She wanted to scream at him, to curse him for putting her here, for handing her a rifle that had dragged her across a line she could never uncross, but the words stuck. Deep inside, beneath the terror and the guilt, a quieter truth pulsed. She had been capable. She had carried the weight. And now, whether she wanted it or not, she would never be the same. The desert lay quiet after the echoes faded, but it was not the same quiet as before. It was heavier now, stained with the memory of what had happened, the sand itself seeming to hold the weight of every shot she had fired. She lay in that silence for a long moment, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the stars overhead as though they might offer answers, but the stars gave nothing back. When she finally pushed herself upright, her muscles screaming in protest, she saw the SEAL standing a few feet away, the Barrett cradled in his arms again, his eyes scanning the darkness where the enemies had fallen. His expression was carved from stone, unreadable, but his posture carried the unmistakable awareness of someone who knew the night wasn't finished yet. She wanted to demand answers, to ask who those men had been, why they were there, why he had forced her hand instead of pulling the trigger himself. But when she opened her mouth the words stuck. The truth was she wasn't ready to know. Her body was still trembling with the shock of what she had done, and her mind clung desperately to denial, to the fragile hope that if she didn't say it aloud then maybe it hadn't really happened. The SEAL finally turned, his voice cutting through the silence, deep and calm. "We need to move. More will come." The simple certainty of his words sent a fresh spike of fear through her, but she rose anyway, her legs shaky under her hands still raw from gripping the rifle. He slung the Barrett across his back once more and set off toward the rocks that rose jagged to the east. She followed, her boots slipping in the loose sand, the night air cold against her damp skin. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the crunch of their steps and the distant cry of a desert bird. Every shadow looked like an enemy, every gust of wind like a whisper of pursuit, and though exhaustion dragged at her bones she forced herself to keep going, because to stop now felt like death. Eventually they reached a shallow cave carved into the rocks, its mouth half hidden by scrub. The SEAL ducked inside first, scanning with the precision of habit, then motioned for her to follow. The air inside was cooler, damp, the sound of their breathing amplified by stone. He set the rifle down carefully against the wall and lit a small lamp, its soft glow pushing back the dark just enough to make the space feel less suffocating. She sank down onto the stone floor, her body aching, her mind still reeling. For a while he said nothing, just sat across from her, his broad shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes reflecting the lamp's glow like fragments of steel. Finally she couldn't hold it in anymore. "Why did you make me do it?" Her voice cracked, the words spilling out raw, jagged. "You could have taken the shots. You didn't need me. Why me?" He met her gaze steadily, and for the first time since the training began, she saw weariness in him, not physical but something deeper, a heaviness etched into the lines of his face. "Because one day," he said slowly, "I won't be here. And you'll be holding the weight whether you want to or not. Better you face it with me than face it alone." She shook her head violently, her hands balling into fists. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this." Her voice echoed against the stone walls, thin and desperate. He didn't flinch. No one ever does. But life doesn't wait for what you want. It puts the weight in your hands and you either carry it, or you let it crush you. His words sank deep, and though she wanted to reject them, to throw them back at him, something inside her knew they were true. The memory of the muzzle flashes from the ridge, the bullets striking stone near where they lay, the certainty that those men had been hunting them, it all whispered the same truth. If she hadn't pulled the trigger, she wouldn't be sitting here now. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pressing her forehead against them, her breath ragged. Silence stretched long between them, broken only by the faint hiss of the lamp. After what felt like hours, she finally lifted her head, her eyes red, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Does it ever get easier?" His eyes softened slightly, but his answer was honest, stripped of comfort. "No. You just learn to live with it." The weight of that answer pressed down on her, but strangely, it didn't break her. Instead, it settled into her bones like a truth she had always known but never faced. She sat in that cave with him, the desert night heavy outside, the Barrett silent against the wall, and realized that she had crossed a line she could never uncross. She wasn't the same girl who had walked onto the training field at sunset, thinking this was just another routine practice. She was someone else now, someone who had seen what she was capable of, someone who had felt the terrible weight of power in her hands and survived it. The SEAL leaned back against the stone, his eyes closing briefly, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the soldier, tired, human, burdened by ghosts she couldn't name. She wanted to ask about them, to understand what had carved those scars into him, what memories haunted him enough to see himself in her, but she stayed silent. Some questions carried answers too heavy for words. Instead she shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his arm, a small gesture but one that seemed to ground them both. For a moment neither spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of survival, of two people bound now by something unspoken, something forged in fire and shadow. She knew the night wasn't over, that more danger could come, that the world beyond this cave still waited with teeth bared, but for now, in this fragile pause, she let herself breathe. The night stretched long inside the cave, each hour blending into the next, but sleep never truly came for her. Every time her eyes drifted closed, she would see the flashes again, the recoil of the rifle rattling her bones, the silhouettes dropping in the distance, and her chest would seize with the memory of it. She would jolt awake, gasping softly, and find the SEAL still there, leaning against the rock, his eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep, his hand never far from the Barrett. His presence was a strange paradox, both unsettling in its intensity and comforting in its constancy. He didn't speak, didn't offer reassurances, but simply by being there he made the silence less suffocating. When dawn finally broke, spilling a pale light across the desert, he rose without a word and motioned for her to follow. She was stiff, her body aching from the cold stone, but she pushed herself up and fell into step behind him, their shadows stretching long across the sand. The desert felt different in the daylight, still vast and unforgiving but no longer hiding threats in every shadow. Yet the silence between them remained heavy, filled with unspoken questions. She thought about asking him again who those men had been, why they had attacked, why he had handed her the rifle instead of taking the shots himself, but every time the words rose to her lips she swallowed them back. Some part of her feared that knowing would make everything worse, that truth would be more dangerous than ignorance. They walked for hours, the sun climbing higher, burning hot against their skin. He set a brutal pace, his steps steady, purposeful, as though he carried a map in his head that no one else could see. She stumbled more than once, her throat dry, sweat stinging her eyes, but she forced herself to keep up. Every time she faltered she remembered his words, "Life doesn't wait for what you want," and she clenched her jaw and pushed harder. By the time the sun reached its zenith they came upon the rusted skeleton of an old outpost, half buried in sand, its walls crumbling but still offering shade. The SEAL ducked inside, scanning as always, then motioned her in. They sat in silence, the air thick with heat, and she finally broke, the questions spilling out of her like water from a cracked dam. Who were they? The men last night. What did they want? And why me? He didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip from his canteen, wiped the sweat from his brow, and then met her gaze with the weight of someone who had carried secrets too long. They weren't random, he said finally, his voice low. They were looking for me. And if they couldn't find me, they'd have taken you instead. The words sent a chill through her even in the blistering heat. Me? What? I'm nobody. His eyes softened just slightly, though his tone stayed hard. You're not nobody. Not to them. And not to me. She stared at him, heart hammering, waiting for more, but he turned his gaze back toward the desert, as if the horizon itself demanded his attention. Frustration bubbled up in her chest. That doesn't mean anything. You can't just say that and stop. I deserve to know. He sighed, a sound heavy with reluctance, and finally spoke again. There are people out there who believe your leverage. Against me. Against what I stand for. They think putting you in the crosshairs gives them power. And last night you proved them wrong. She shook her head, anger and fear tangling inside her. I didn't prove anything. I was terrified. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. I didn't want to pull that trigger. I didn't want any of this. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with fierce intensity. And that's exactly why you had to. Because the ones who want it don't understand what it costs. You do now. You understand the weight. That makes you stronger than they'll ever be. His words cut into her, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath them she felt something stirring, a flicker of strength, fragile but real. She wanted to reject it, to cling to the belief that she was still the girl she had been before all this, but deep down she knew she wasn't. Something had changed, and though it terrified her, it also felt undeniable. Silence fell again, thick and uneasy, until finally he rose to his feet. We can't stay here. Come on. They set out once more, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, the sun sinking slowly toward the horizon. The day passed in weary steps, every muscle in her body screaming, but she kept moving, her mind a storm of thoughts. By the time night fell again, painting the world in silver and shadow, they reached a narrow canyon, its walls rising high on either side. The seal led her inside, his movements cautious, his eyes scanning every ledge. She followed close, her nerves fraying with every echo of their footsteps. When they finally settled in a sheltered alcove, she collapsed against the stone, exhausted beyond words. He sat nearby, the Barrett across his lap, his eyes never still. She studied him in the dim light, the way his jaw tightened when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his fingers brushed the rifle like it was both weapon and burden. For the first time she realized that he carried more than just the weight of the fight. He carried the weight of responsibility, of keeping her alive, of shaping her into someone who could survive without him. And though she still didn't understand why he had chosen her, a part of her began to trust that he had his reasons. The desert night stretched around them once more, vast and endless, but she no longer felt completely alone. She had seen the man behind the soldier, glimpsed the cracks in his armor, and though the future was still uncertain, one truth had taken root inside her. The girl who had walked into routine practice was gone, and in her place was someone new, someone untested but unbroken, someone who had pulled the trigger and lived to carry its weight. The final night came without warning, creeping in under a blood-orange sunset that set the canyon walls aflame, and she felt it in her bones before he even said a word. The seal had grown restless as the day wore on, his eyes sharper, his silence heavier, his movements edged with an anticipation she didn't understand but could feel pulsing in the air around them. When the last light drained from the sky he rose, shouldering the Barrett, and looked at her with a gravity that made her throat tighten. They'll come tonight, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. No explanation, no detail, just certainty, and it chilled her more than any warning could. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling despite her efforts to keep them steady, but she didn't ask the questions clawing at her chest. She knew by now he would only tell her what she needed, nothing more. They set up along the canyon ledge, the wind carrying whispers through the rocks, the stars glittering overhead like indifferent witnesses. He handed her the Barrett once more, the weight familiar now but no less daunting, and guided her into position with the same careful precision he had shown that first night. His hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment, steadying, grounding, and then he stepped back, retreating into the shadows, leaving her alone behind the rifle's cold scope. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her breath shallow, but this time the fear was different. It was sharp, focused, not the wild panic of before. She had been through the fire now, and though she still dreaded what was coming, she also felt a strange clarity, a quiet knowledge that she could not run from this anymore. The desert stretched wide in the moonlight, silent for long minutes that felt like hours, and then they came, dark figures moving with precision, their shapes shifting across the sand like shadows come to life. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the steel cool against her skin, her breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to look for the seal, to beg him to take the shot, but she forced herself to stay steady. His words echoed in her head, "You either carry it or you let it crush you," and she knew this moment was hers alone. The first shot cracked like thunder, shattering the night, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, but she held steady, her eye never leaving the scope. A figure fell. Then another. The canyon erupted with chaos, shouts and flashes of gunfire, the sharp whistle of bullets striking stone, but she kept firing, her hands trembling but her focus unbroken. The world narrowed to the circle of glass in front of her eye, every breath a battle, every pull of the trigger a decision. Somewhere in the chaos she heard the SEAL's voice, low and steady, calling out positions, guiding her aim without taking the weapon from her. She realized then that he wasn't testing her anymore, he was trusting her. And for the first time she trusted herself. Minutes stretched like lifetimes, the canyon filling with echoes of violence, until at last the silence returned, heavy and absolute. Smoke hung in the air, acrid and bitter, the sand scarred by bullet holes and shadows that no longer moved. She lowered the Barrett slowly, her body shaking, her chest heaving with every ragged breath. Her hands were raw, her shoulder bruised, her ears ringing, but she was alive. More than that, she had survived not because of him but alongside him. When she looked up he was there, emerging from the shadows, his eyes on her with an expression she had never seen before, something between pride and sorrow, relief and resignation. He didn't speak, didn't need to. She understood now in a way words could never capture. He had given her the weapon because he knew one day she would have to hold it, because he knew the only way to carry the weight was to face it head-on. And she had. She felt tears sting her eyes, hot and unrelenting, but she didn't hide them. She let them fall, streaking her dirt-stained cheeks, proof that she was still human, that the part of her that grieved was just as real as the part of her that fought. He came closer then, crouching beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, steadying her trembling frame. "You did it," he said softly, the words more gift than praise. She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with everything she wanted to say and couldn't. The desert stretched silent around them, endless and vast, and for the first time since this began she felt the weight of the Barrett ease just slightly. It would never leave her completely, she knew that now, but it no longer felt like it would crush her. It felt like something she could carry. The SEAL stood then, offering her his hand, and she took it, rising on unsteady legs. Together they walked out of the canyon, their shadows long against the pale sand, the night cool on their skin. She didn't know where they were going, what dangers still lay ahead, or what it meant for her future, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not the same girl who had walked into routine practice. That girl had been broken open, remade in fire and steel, tested against fear itself, and though the scars would remain, she had emerged alive, stronger, ready to face whatever came next. And as they disappeared into the desert night, the stars burning cold above, she carried with her the memory of the rifle, the echo of its weight, and the knowledge that sometimes survival meant shouldering a burden you never asked for, and finding, against all odds, that you were strong enough to carry it. The end.